This is the work from the most recent studio that Greg and I have taught, and that was in the spring semester. And I think, like many of you, our students went away to spring break at the beginning of March, and then we had here at NC State a week off after that, as the university scrambled to move things to online. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both how we planned the studio generally and the way that we've sort of set it up, but also about what we ended up doing really this semester, and what worked and didn't work, and the results from this semester specifically. So we've got, I'm the architecture professor. Greg Lucier is the civil engineering professor and is the manager of the constructed facilities lab here on NC State's campus. That is a full-scale testing facility on Centennial's campus that we have access to through Greg's management. And so that gives us some resources here at the university that our students make very good use of throughout their studio. I will also say, as an architecture professor, I have a general teaching load of a studio each semester and a support course. This studio was actually the first course that Greg has taught at NC State. So this has been his first and only teaching experience. He's done extremely well as part of this, but this was also just new for him. So it's new not only because the majority of the classwork that we have been doing has been in an architecture studio. So it's a format unknown to both Greg and his students, but they hopefully we make them feel right at home throughout the course of the semester as they're going. So the way that we've used the PCI Foundation funding, there are three primary areas that we have been using it for. One is faculty release time, especially because Greg does not have any teaching responsibilities as part of his contract here. It's used to help release him so that he can help teach the course, and then also helps me in terms of, helps our school in terms of taking me away from a required studio and allowing me to teach this as what's called an option studio. Funding also pays for the constructed facilities lab fee to use their facilities, and then student materials and printing costs. Generally at NC State, we are a university that makes a lot of things, both at the university, but also in the School of Architecture. And so a lot of our students are doing both hands-on, large-scale pieces, but also a lot of model building and things like that. Some of that, of course, due to COVID was put on hold as we moved from an in-studio setting to a virtual setting. The way that the studio course is set up, we introduce the first project, which is a case study project in which the students look at a precedent study, and those precedents are of existing architectural projects that have made innovative uses of precast concrete. We often look at them from the manufacturing and fabrication side, so that the students actually learn that there doesn't have to be a one-to-one relationship between the mold and the panel. And so things that Carlos had talked about, such as tessellation, but other ways of perhaps doing double-sided molds or flipping molds and things like that, the students are introduced to that at the very beginning. The second project is a full-scale casting and testing project in which the students in very large teams are asked to design and cast architectural precast panels. The molds are built at the College of Design's fabrication shop, and then we transfer those molds to the Constructed Facilities Lab. And there we actually cast full size, just not full scale. They're fairly small. They're about 3 foot by 3 foot architectural panels. The students are responsible for doing the mix design, figuring out the rebar, the attachment layouts, the mold design and fabrication, fabricating the mold, stripping it, and all of those sort of sets processes. And generally at the end of the day, we like to hang them on a metal frame, but this was put on hold due to COVID. And then the last is a full building design in which the students design a total precast project over about 10 weeks. That is an individual project, and then there is a civil engineering architecture or civil engineering consultant on each project that answers questions and helps give feedback in terms of the structural design. There's actually overlap between these projects, so that as the case study is winding down, we start on the full-scale casting and testing, and then as that starts winding down into production mode, we start on the building design aspect of it. So that allows us to sort of slip one project into the next. We have a whole series of associated activities as part of this, and so we are very fortunate to have a local precaster, Gate Precast, up in Oxford, which is only 45 minutes away. And so we do a tour of their facility as part of that, and that has always been fantastic. We've also had the advantage because sometimes the precedent project in which the students are working on, Gate may have been the producer for that, and so Gate has been very generous with sharing images and shop drawings of that. We've also been fortunate because the Domino Sugar project the Gate was working on has parts of those components were also fabricated out of the Oxford facility. And so that allowed the students to see, again, that would be a precedent on for that assignment, and that would allow the students to see that. There is a tour of Tyndall, which is a little bit further away in Virginia, which does primarily structural precast, and the structural engineers get very excited about that. And they go there. There's software training both for the civil engineering students so that they can run some analysis software, and then the architecture students have some software training on Grasshopper and Rhino, because that's not part of our typical curriculum. Ray Clark from US Formliner has been extremely generous with his time and materials, and has come and done a workshop in our materials lab demonstrating how to cast rubber formliners. JVI also comes and talks to the group about connections, and then we of course have been blessed to have sponsorship both from Peter and the PCI Foundation for the students to go to the convention and bridge conference. And I should say, I don't know, Peter, why you're not on here, but Peter, of course, also comes as part of this and talks to our students, introduces them to precast, and shares with them all the materials and things that they're going to be using throughout the semester. So the first project, which is the case study project, that changes from year to year depending upon what we're going to be doing for the building design project. I like the precedents to be sort of in line with that, especially if we're dealing with window openings or perhaps photo engraving or other types of techniques for the students to think about. So this is just the list from this semester. And then the students both look at the existing architecture, and then they do a series of analysis diagrams. It's important for me on the architecture side, not only that they understand the material of precast concrete, but that they also understand how the use of that material may relate to the overall project design. So the students do structural diagrams and things like that, but they also are asked to do enclosure diagrams and partie diagrams so that they understand the relationship of the material, how it's fabricated, but again, relative to the overall design concept. The structural engineers work with the architecture students on this in terms of answering questions that they may have and understanding about how the structure for the precedent may be done. Some of the work is done through drawings when we have them, but also construction photos and things like that. As part of the case study, it's important to me, and I guess the way that we teach the studio, for the students to understand how something is made can tell you how it can be designed. So the students actually do some in-depth diagramming about the panelization themselves. For this particular project, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, is a vertically cast UHPC panel that's done. So the panels are actually two-sided, meaning they've got two finished faces. So each panel iteration comes with a front and back face that can be used. And the students start looking at how do you maximize repeatability, but balancing that with the architect's sort of inherent desire for uniqueness. The students are also asked to do models of parts of the precedent component, and they're actually asked to replicate the fabrication of the model and of the casting of the panel similarly to how the precedent was done. So in this particular case, there was a rubber mold used, and so you're seeing they CNC'd out a master. They then cast a rubber mold. They then took that rubber mold and oriented it vertically and then cast the piece into there. So you're actually sort of seeing the students go through the step-by-step process for their case study so that they can actually sort of understand that fabrication process. As I said, we also, are able to go to GATE. So we have a GATE precast tour, and we're able to see their facilities there and how large the pieces are. We're seeing them on the truck, out in the storage yard. And then we have US Formliner that also comes to our materials lab. And as you can see, there's Ray there showing to our students how rubber molds are cast. The students for their second project do a full-scale casting and testing assignment, this has been done so that the students can work directly with the materials at hand. Our students in general, I say both the engineering students and the architecture students really like working at full scale and full size and getting their hands dirty. These are the two panels that were done this year. The panels are, the project for the building design is given to the students before the panels are designed. And so the students are actually asked to design panels that would be in reflection of the design for the full-scale building. This particular year, we asked the students, they were going to be designing an extension to the College of Design here at NC State. And so we here at NC State in the College of Design have a very rich history of being associated with the Bauhaus in terms of an education model. And so the students went and looked at early Bauhaus drawings as a way of starting to figure out how to articulate the architectural precast panels of this. So these are the two sets of projects, or the two sets of panels that were done. As part of this project, the students actually go through and they make their molds. Generally, they've been doing it with a CNC machine, and then they use Formliners cast by rubber provided from US Formliner. So they go through the mold prep, the sanding exercise, the waxing of it, the casting, the stripping, the tessellation of the pattern. And then, so on the left, you can see us at our materials lab at the College of Design. And the students are all very excited to strip their rubber from the molds. And then on the right-hand side, you're starting to see them get ready to cast their panels at the Constructed Facilities Lab and starting to lay out rebar and things like that. So they actually place the concrete. You can see all the connections embedded in the pieces, both on the side connections for stripping, but also in terms of lateral and bearing connections, placing of concrete and going through and vibrating it. So they're going through all of these pieces as part of this. And then going through and stripping. So this is where we were at essentially right before spring break. And so generally what we do at this point in time is that we actually ask the students to use the mold a second time. They don't have to cast, again, it doesn't have to be a one-to-one relationship between the mold design and the panel. So most times the molds have been tessellated in some sort of way. And both sets of teams were challenged to turn a corner with their design. Both sets of teams had actually decided to do a cold joint. And so what you're seeing is the rebar sticking up as to where the other panel would be cast up against it. They do often like to sign their panels. And so you see the handprints of each one of the team members in the back of it. And this is as far as we got. So unfortunately, we are now sitting with the panels at the CFL. The students were very proud of their work. They're currently, I think, still sort of sitting outside. Our hope had been that we could get some of them to perhaps do the second panel during the summer, but that probably doesn't look likely. But the panels themselves, I think, turned out really nicely, and we're hoping to figure out how we may actually finish them up as part of this project. The final project is the building design. It's 10 weeks, and it's individually done by the architecture students. Our campus, in terms of the College of Design, is located in these three buildings. We've got Brooks Hall, which is the main building, Camp Hefner, which is the newest of our buildings from about 1960. And then we have Liaisar over here on the other side of the road. So you can see next to us, we have an open parking lot. This is actually the low point of the campus right here. And so this parking lot essentially acts as the drainage channel for almost everything that is in the highlighted rectangle. So water is an issue on campus. And so students were asked to think about that in terms of design. And then we have an existing Amtrak railroad track that runs right through the middle of campus right here. So these are just some of the designs that came out of the studio. After spring break, we had a little bit of an opportunity right before spring break to work on conceptual design. But essentially from after spring break, we did everything via Zoom. And so we would live comment on people's drawings, and we essentially ran our Zoom course similar to Studio. So there would be one Zoom call that everybody would listen in on and hear desk crits normally as they would be going. The engineering students would come in as needed during their time. Greg would be there and I would be there. We also commented directly through Annotate. We were able to comment directly on people's drawings. So these are just the results. We don't have any models built, certainly, from the studio as part of it. So everything was done in SketchUp. And as part of the studio, we still like to do wall sections and things like that. You still see things like double T's being shown in the plan and in this section so that there is some idea of the structure behind the pieces. And we did go through all the wall sections, working with the students to start thinking about how the projects were going to come together in terms of the detailing at the end. This is one of the other examples. Again, you can see here is Camp Hefner and Brooks Hall. And this project mainly came up with two components. There was the studio section, but also a library for the College of Design. And in all of them, there is an architectural panel or a sort of finalization that's being used on the building. So I wanted the students to at least get to some understanding about the architectural quality of the precast in addition to the structural quality of the precast. So that's it. Be happy to answer any questions. I don't know, Greg, if you had any comments that you wanted to say?
Tristan, we're hearing your rain. Can you mute yours?
So nothing specific to add, but we have the interplay between architecture and engineering, which I think has worked out very well for students in both groups. The engineering students come in with no concept of how any of the studio process works, and frankly, that's how I started as well. So that's not certainly a surprise. But they integrate very nicely with the architecture group, and I think vice versa. I think eyes are opened up on both sides as to the constraints that each group is dealing with, and that's a fun thing to see and a fun thing to be part of. So I think that part of it especially has been very successful for us.
I will just also add, I think when COVID came through, you're never quite sure what's going to end up happening. But we had a really great group of students this semester who took everything in stride. And they, even within studio, but even outside of studio, they sort of self-organized and would desk crit each other off of Zoom. And I know that they met with their engineers as well outside of class time. So I think that the work, I think despite the sort of challenges that we ended up going through this semester, I think the work at the end actually, aside from sort of model work or not being able to finish the panels, I think the work that resulted from this studio was probably some of the strongest that we've had.
I'll mention that the South Atlantic Region AIA is having a student design competition as part of their next conference, and at least 2 of your students have entered that with these recent designs, and I know I offered for all of our studios to pay the entry fee for those students, and 2 of them have taken me up on that, so we hope they're successful in that.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Any other comments, questions for Dana and Greg?
Yeah, I do have one thing I'd like to ask you, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit more when we go into a brainstorming session. But if you could speak a little bit about the challenges, and if you had to do it again, how would you do this in terms of going online?
So one of the things that I would recommend, so we use Zoom. Our university has both a Zoom account and Google Hangouts. So we have access to Zoom. And so we just set up one meeting, and it was a reoccurring meeting, and it just happened all the time, meaning from studio. And so we met synchronistically during studio, but I didn't require any of my students to specifically be there during times, but we did welcome everybody when they came. And we often had a sort of whiteboard session, which Zoom allows, so we could sketch directly on. I actually have a touch screen and a Bluetooth pen, so I can sketch directly on my screen. And so we use the whiteboard function to sort of, talk about what we were going to talk about or just check in with everybody. And then often at the end of studio, we would also use the whiteboard function, and whether that was me or Greg sort of talking through certain things. So especially when we were, like, say, going on to the wall section, right? I had Greg take over, and he talked about all the different ways that a floor can connect to a load-bearing wall, right? And so we went through those and allowed the students to choose, and we would draw the wall sections or the section details to think through that. And so that was a good way of sort of making sure that the students were there at the beginning and at the end and just trying to check in, right? Because, and at the same time, most of the time we ended up not seeing them other than the desk critting time. The students did self-organize and do time slots for when they would do their desk crits. That was really helpful, and they would plan out for that whole week. And that was just done through Google Sheets. And so I just knew as people were going. I tried keeping the time, but to be honest, like it was more of an order thing than anything else. The only thing that I would say, so I think all of that went really well. I think Greg and I were very flexible in the way of managing the students, especially because, students may have, I had a couple of students who had some family health issues during the time, and even our really good students, just like, I wouldn't see them for a couple of class periods, and I would email and check in, but other than that, you just sort of have to let them go. But the work that they did, I thought was really strong, so I didn't worry about it. The only other thing that I would say is we did a Zoom presentation for the final presentation. That was okay. I think I have heard from colleagues of mine that there is another program. I want to call it Merge. I'll have to double check, Carlos, and I'll put it in the chat function. The ACSA, which is the Association for Collegiate Schools of Architecture, actually recommends another program. That it sort of acts like one big board, and it allows each of the users to actually zoom into particular areas rather than just watching a sort of passive presentation with PowerPoint or something else. So that allows the reviewers to perhaps zoom in particular things that they're interested in without being sort of held hostage to the student, right, in terms of what they're presenting. So David Hill, our department head, went to one review through that program and said for a final review, he found that fantastic as opposed to Zoom. So that's the only thing that I thought, oh yeah, that does actually sound a lot better. And I think, so the reviews, I think, were a little bit more awkward than they normally would have been. But I think, to be honest, I think the desk crits went as well as they could have gone. But a lot of that was patience with us, but also patience by my students. I think the students, we ended up having a really good group, and they were all sort of like, yes, we're all going to do the best job we can and figure it out. So I felt very blessed by that this semester.
So we have some dedicated time to talk about specifically these types of things. So I don't know if you noticed my subtle hook here, but I've put Georgia Tech up on the screen.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yep. So,
but I'll put in the chat function that other program that was recommended.
Yeah, Liz did have a question for Greg, Peter.
Yeah, see, there's a question in the chat. We can talk about it in brainstorming, or do you want to discuss it now on the interfacing with engineering students?
It's up to you, Greg.
Greg, you want to answer that?
Sure. So registering for classes, I guess, is the simplest one to answer. So we basically have to keep our registration separate. So Dana has her studio class in the School of Architecture. I have, it's a course number used for independent study, but it was an available course number in our engineering curriculum. Creating a new course, getting it through ABET and all of that. ABET is our accrediting body. It is a many-year process, so that was not realistic. So we had to fit it in with existing course numbers in the existing curriculum plans within the existing accreditation. So we did that to the best of our ability with the existing course numbers. And then we just scheduled our course to meet at the same time as Dana's course. And my students showed up in the studio. So they acted as if they were one course, but on paper, they were sort of two parallel courses. There are some complexities there in contact hours and so forth. So my students were receiving credit for 3 hours. I think Dana's students, it's a 6-hour studio class. So there's a big disparity in the amount of time. So my students were not in the studio all of the time that the architecture students were, but we addressed that by basically setting up the premise of the course. And this gets to the first part of the question, in that we say the engineering students are acting as consultants to the architects. So we think of it almost as a design firm, in the sense the architects are leading the projects, the assignments in this case, and the engineers are assigned to work with them in different combinations, anything from one-on-one to some projects where 2 engineers to a group of architects, just depending on how the numbers break down. And for the final project, each engineer had multiple architects they were working with one-on-one on multiple projects. So it created a nice, somewhat realistic experience. They had to manage different projects and manage their time and so forth. And our intent was to make it somewhat realistic, what you might see in a design office. And the students seemed to appreciate that, and they could do that well.